Hi everyone, this is Deirdre Benjamin, and we're going to talk about Tragedy of the Commons in this PowerPoint. This PowerPoint also encompasses the podcast called the NPR podcast about the Trojan, calling a dock either a Trojan horse or a Noah's Ark, and they don't mean that in the biblical sense. They mean it in kind of an analogy. So please, if you're responding to that post as a forum post, please do not use the Bible. It's not a literal point of view. It is trying to take it and use it as an analogy. So was it a good thing by transporting creatures across the sea, or was it a bad thing as being something that was carrying these harmful invasive species to a new area? So you'll have that podcast. You'll have a couple other links on there to articles about Tragedy of the Commons in terms of the Gulf oil spill and the toothy species, the Asian carp, which are both invasive species. And then you'll have an article that you need to read about Tragedy of the Commons from Garrett Hardin. Make sure you click on it and read the entire article because it's absolutely important, and we'll discuss it a little bit in this PowerPoint. So, Tragedy of the Commons. So we're going to describe the Tragedy of the Commons and explain why invasive species at some times are considered Tragedy of the Commons. So, Tragedy of the Commons. William Foster Lloyd, a professor of political economy, published a series of papers in 1833. In 2 lectures on the checks of population, he introduced the concept of what we call a common. Now remember, when he wrote this in 1833, he was not, his idea of what the future was going to be, he had no sense that the world would explode the way it has in both population, in terms of agriculture, in terms of the Industrial Revolution, all sorts of things. So when you're thinking back to his writing, you have to make sure you think in terms of the 1800s when he wrote these articles. So he introduced this idea, this concept of the commons, and while he talked about it in terms of population, we can actually portray this into almost all environmental issues today, which is a common, and that is a shared space. So this can include world commons such as oceans, air we breathe, land. We all share this, no matter what it's not separated. If a volcano erupts in, let's say, in Iceland, the effects can be felt for thousands of miles away. Even on the Pacific coast, we can feel the ramifications of this. So we're all tied together. We all share the same water worldwide, whether we think so or not. We all share it. So it's a shared common. So William Foster Lloyd actually talked about this idea of a commons, and so he gave these people in these lectures, he gave them an analogy that they would relate to at the time. And at the time it was this idea of a pasture, a sheep pasture. And on the left, you will see, this is a shared space. So all of the farmers have their sheep herding in one area. And when you think about that, we have this inherent need for greed as humans. So we look for our short-term gain in terms of commons, rather than thinking about the long-term interests of everyone. Just take a second and think about that. Is that we often look for our short-term gain in terms of commons, rather than thinking about the long-term interests of everyone involved. And this can be anywhere from littering. So you're thinking about your short-term gain, which is, I don't want to carry my garbage around, so you litter. But you're not thinking of the long-term interests of everyone. First of all, littering does bring down housing values. Number 2, it can get into our waterways and it can kill fish. It can really contaminate ecosystems. So you're thinking of your short-term gain. So William Foster Lloyd talked about this idea that, we have this pasture here, and in the commons, people will inherently want to add more sheep because that is their inherent nature for greed, which is, hey, I can make more money if I add a couple more sheep. But if we all do that, we're going to destroy the common. So there's not going to be enough grass for the sheep to graze on because we're thinking of our short-term interest, which is money now, rather than the long-term interests of everyone, which is that we could all raise a certain amount of sheep in a good way on this property. So Lloyd brings up the idea that the only way to solve these commons issues is to actually give private property. So he's talking about individual private property. And he says if we divide up commons into individual properties, people are more likely to take care of their space because they own it. And now this does make sense in a sense, is that we do tend to take care of our things more if we own them. So if we owned our property, we'd be more likely to take care of our property. Or if we own our portion of the ocean, we'll be more likely to take care of our portion of the ocean. Now, listen, this brings up a lot of other issues. So when William Foster Lloyd wrote about this, he wasn't really thinking about, kind of where we are today. So he used the scenario of the pastures to convey his message. It was in the best interest of the individual to put as many animals in the commons as possible. He was looking toward his short-term interest, which is money, from wool, rather than the long-term interests of everyone. And so, this kind of PowerPoint moves through this in words. So everyone was looking for that short-term gain rather than the long-term interest, which would have to have a sustainable area to raise sheep and have economic stability forever. So in order to solve this problem, we suggested privatization, and so the commons were eventually replaced by closed fields, and the owners were supposed to be now careful. Now, he just didn't think about the idea that, he didn't think about moral compass in terms of this, and so I want to bring in moral compass, which is the fact that that's one of the big issues with William Foster Lloyd's idea on how to solve the commons is to privatize everything, is because he didn't think that, he kept thinking that everyone had the same moral compass, good moral compass. But in reality, we know tons of people who do not have really good moral compass. Think about a slumlord who owns a property and all he's looking for is his own short-term gain out of it. So he's not, just because he owns it doesn't mean that he has the right moral compass. You can think about this in terms of our government. Our government owns, we all own land, which is called our BML land, which is our Bureau of Land Management land, and our government decided to lease out that land to fracking companies, but they didn't, they didn't think. They were looking for the short-term gain rather than the long-term interests of everyone. So moral compass is a huge issue with privatization, and that's why privatization doesn't always work, because you need to make sure the person that privatizes has moral compass. So in 1960s, Garrett Hardin, and you're going to read this article called Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin, he actually coined the phrase tragedy of the commons. So William Foster Lloyd used the term commons, and in 1960, Garrett Hardin wrote this rebuttal and said, dude, this is why privatization doesn't work. It's because you need to have moral compass. And so he termed the misuse of commons as a tragedy of the commons, and in his essay he also gives solutions to this tragedy of the commons, including government ownership, mutual coercion, and education. So he speaks about how these issues will continue to exist in commons with welfare states. So we live in welfare states, which is the fact that we think of, we think of everything as a whole, and so this could be an issue. So Garrett Hardin came later, and he coined the phrase tragedy of the commons, and he brought up a new one. So he said, this is the problem. So Garrett Hardin said in his rebuttal to William Foster Lloyd, number one, problems with ownership. What happens when the owner doesn't have moral compass? Also, is it really a commons anymore? If we privatize something, is it a commons anymore? A commons is a shared space. Once you privatize something, it's not a commons anymore. We could, I could charge people whatever amount of money they want, but is it really shared by everybody? No, because, this is a big problem. So once you privatize something, then are you making it a commons anymore? No, you're privatizing it. So as per Garrett Hardin, he said, okay, but the government could own it. And I discussed a little bit back why the government might not be the best owner, but of course they do own most of our resources. So government owns national parks, and we do this on purpose, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are no technical solutions as per Garrett Hardin. Rather, the only solution is education. So he's saying that, we could go to government ownership, we could do mutual coercion, but the only real solution is education. So issues with government ownership is the fact that our government does own national parks. They own a lot of it. And the reason for that is that we don't really want to take care of commons. Commons are too hard for us to take care of, so we would much rather put a government agency in charge of them. And that's a great idea on paper, is that, here's the taxes, here's our money, you're going to take care of our common space. We're going to give the government ownership of our common space. And that works. And you'll read in the article his ideas about national parks, and that, it does work in a way. You'll hear him kind of discuss national parks in terms of overuse of national parks, is that now, they're common space, but we kind of, we need help from the government to take care of these common spaces. So when you read the article, make sure you read that section on national parks and, his thoughts on government ownership of national parks, etc. He actually believes that a lot of things should be privatized. I believe differently. I think that privatizing things is going to be hard because a lot more companies have their own special interests rather than the interests of the whole involved. The one thing that I truly align with in terms of Garrett Hardin's article, and you'll read about this, is education. Education is the key. He says that it may take years to happen because, remember, education takes generations in order to ingrain the idea of education, but everyone needs to be educated on how each one of us affect each other. If we were educated, then each one of us affects each other in everything we do. We would be more mindful of our decisions we make. For example, by me throwing my garbage into a vacant lot, I am dealing with my short-term interests, which is not having to carry trash to the next trash can, but I'm looking at the long-term interests of the neighborhood, which is lower housing value, etc. So, we need to think about that in terms of Tragedy of the Commons. So make sure when you're reading the article on Tragedy of the Commons, you read, you understand William Foster Lloyd's principles, but then you also read Garrett Hardin's rebuttal, and his rebuttal has fantastic writing on terms of what is a commons. He talks about government ownership, he talks about education, he talks about mutual coercion, that we can't have a world where we share commons where it's a total welfare state, meaning everything is subsidized, and he talks about that. It's an interesting point, especially in today's day and age where there's a lot of fires in terms of socialization of a lot of aspects. So you want to make sure you read that. Now, invasive species are a great example of a tragedy of the commons, a current day tragedy of the commons. In fact, there's a lot of talk recently about man-o'-wars, which are these jellyfish that are washing up on the Jersey Shore. And they're invasive species, that's what they are. So invasive species are tragedy of the commons only when a human introduces them for their own gain. So if a human introduces an invasive species for their own gain, their short-term interest, for example, I like a flower when I'm visiting another country, and I sneak it in my suitcase and I bring it back. But little do I know that flower, if I plant it here, invades a territory, or it has a spider on it that then invades an area. So an invasive species can be a tragedy of the commons when it's brought in for a short-term gain and then becomes a major problem. And you can find out more about the invasive species portion of this when you watch the video on Asian carp, which were brought in to aid in pond algae, and now they're taking over entire waterways. You can read about that in terms of the toothy pike as well. There's also tons of them out there, so you want to make sure you read up on what, a specific type of invasive species and why it is a tragedy of the commons. It's only a tragedy of the commons when we bring it in for our short-term gain. When nature does it itself, it's not a tragedy of the commons. So make sure you keep that in mind.